Army Historical Research's online series of talks. We're really quite privileged this evening because our speaker is speaking to us from Australia, where it's 5 o'clock in the morning. So that's really real dedication to the task. I've noticed from the registrations that there are a lot of regulars here. So you know that I start these presentations with a brief run through of how the Demio platform works. I do that for a number of reasons, but one of them is to give people a chance to join the room, those that are not like me who clock on dead on 7 o'clock. So Demio works through the strength of your broadband connection. And if this evening you might have any problems with the video or audio feed that you're receiving, then it will be down to the strength or weakness of your broadband connection. If that happens to you, there are 3 immediate action drills that you can take to rectify the problem. The first immediate action drill is simply to refresh the page on your browser. Now, I say that, but a lot of people don't know how to refresh their page. On almost every browser window, on the top bar, there is a small incomplete circle with an arrow on it. If you click on that, that refreshes your page. The second IA drill, immediate action drill, that you can employ is the old IT crowd trick. And that's simply come out of the browser and then using the same unique link that you used to join this evening, come back in again. Now, 9 times out of 10, either one of those immediate action drills will sort out any problems that you might be having with either your audio or your video. Finally, the third immediate action drill that you can take, if you have access to another browser, then you can use that other browser. So for instance, on my computer, I have access to both Chrome and Safari. Others of you might have access to Microsoft Edge or Firefox, and Demio will work with all 4 of those browsers. So once again, if you switch browser, still use the same unique link, but by using a different browser, you may well overcome any problems that you might have been experiencing. Okay, those are the IA drills if you had bad audio or bad video this evening. If all else fails, then you are at least guaranteed a copy of the recording, which will go out to you automatically a few hours after we have finished tonight's session, and certainly by first thing tomorrow morning. And finally, after that, in a week or two's time after this evening, we will put the recording up on the Society's website. Now, I'm looking down the chat box and see that a number of you are already saying where you're coming from. We have registrations this evening from as far afield as Australia. Yes, seriously, someone's is here from Australia, although I suspect perhaps he or she is watching the recording. Australia, Canada, the United States, France, Turkey, as well, of course, as those that are here with us from the United Kingdom. And I also see that our chairman here, Ashley Truelock, is also here. And it was he, in fact, that suggested our speaker for this evening. The last thing I want to say before I ask our speaker to come on stage is that we encourage you to write your questions in the chat box prior to the question and answer session, which will take place after our speaker has given her talk. We ask you to do that as it occurs to you. That saves time at the end. And also, if she subsequently covers your question in her talk, then clearly I won't put that question to her. So if I could ask Sarah to come onto the stage, please, and I will introduce our speaker properly.
Good morning, everybody.
Hi, Sarah. Okay, our speaker this evening is a Canadian living and working in Australia, where she lectures in international relations in the University of Queensland. She started her career as an academic at the Joint Services College at Shrivenham, where she was there for a brief period before moving on to Oxford. She apparently lives with a family of swimmers. So if we hear a bit of banging going on in about 15 or 20 minutes time, that's them leaving for their early morning dip. She has published 3 books. Her first was based on her thesis, which was on mercenaries, and her latest is the subject, I think, of our talk this evening. So I'm now going to leave the stage and put you into the capable hands of Dr. Sarah Percy.
Well, thank you very much for that lovely welcome, and apologies for my good morning. It is, of course, morning here and presumably evening and all sorts of times where you all are. I am very much going to be speaking to you about my new book today called Forgotten Warriors. It was published last year, and I'm going to actually tell you a bit about the book, but mainly I'm going to focus on the British Army aspects of the research that I've conducted into the subject of women in combat, which is the subject of my book. So I will tell you a little bit. I'll start by telling you a little bit about the book project as a whole, but not very much, and then we'll just delve into those more British aspects as I run through the story of the book. So how I got interested in this research, I think, is really exemplified by this picture. So this is a Viking warrior's grave, which was discovered in the late 19th century. And it was a perfect example of a Viking warrior's grave. It's in a very significant trading outpost. It has all the things that you would expect in a Viking warrior's grave. So it has grave goods, including swords. There's a war horse in there. There's armor. There's weaponry. There's all kinds of exactly what you would expect to find if you were looking for the grave of a very high status Viking warrior. And in fact, so much so that nobody really looked too closely at the grave as the years and the decades went on, because it was just brought up as this definitive example of a Viking warrior. And sometime in the 70s, somebody took a closer look at that skeleton and thought, that skeleton doesn't look quite right. That actually looks like it might be a female skeleton. But people sort of passed that by and didn't come up again. And then in the early 2000s, when bone testing became better and better, the skeleton was tested, and it was demonstrated by about 2018 that in fact it was conclusively female. Now, this skeleton, which everyone had absolutely committed to the idea of being a Viking warrior for well over a century, suddenly this was thrown into doubt, and people were saying, well, it can't possibly be a woman. This skeleton must be male. No, the science is definitive. And then people were saying, well, if it is a woman, maybe she got in there by mistake. Maybe she wasn't supposed to be there at all. Maybe there was some kind of problem, without ever taking the obvious explanation, which is, in fact, that this skeleton is a female skeleton. And the logical conclusion to draw is that she was a Viking warrior of high status, just as people had always assumed that this skeleton was. And this sort of exemplifies for me a lot of the history of women's combat contributions, that they either get forgotten entirely, or they get dismissed, or people present them as something that they're not. And I think that has actually been true throughout a lot of the history of women's combat contributions on the battlefield. And that also, around the same time I was reading about the Viking warrior, I was thinking about this particular puzzle, which is, it's very curious that in modern Western liberal democracies, that the last profession that we have open to women is combat. And that is incredible when you consider that in the United States, for example, they managed to have female astronauts 30 years before they considered to place women in combat. And it wasn't just that women weren't sort of informally discouraged from being in combat. I don't need to tell an audience like this one. In fact, there were legal bars to women's combat participation. And it's very hard for us to think of any other profession that by the 80s, 90s, 2000s, from which women were legally barred on the basis of their gender, particularly, again, in that Western liberal democratic context where you not only have a powerful feminist movement, but you have the mechanism of lawsuits to challenge these exemptions and to try and change them. So I was, as a researcher, I was thinking, well, this is very curious. Why is it that this one profession has taken so long to change? And that led me down the path for the subject of my new book. So when I went to look for answers, what I found was traditional military history. When you look up women, particularly in older books, what you find is something in the W, something along the lines of this, that you get, sure, there are women on the battlefield, but they're always presented as providing sexual services, or they are not, they're not there in any consequential. So I think that that is a very, very crucial element. And I'm just having a small amount of technical difficulty. Hang on one second. There we go. Sorry, I'm back on. I don't know what happened there. So continuing on now, the argument of the book, before I move into this British context, is that I think that not only is this combat exclusion historically very powerful, it wasn't always true. So prior to the 19th century, as we're going to talk about, we see lots of female combat. But reminding women that they weren't allowed to participate in these combat roles has had a very powerful social impact, because it's a very, very good way of explaining that women are not actually completely equal in society, that there is one profession that's actually, by the way, a very important and critical profession for national security reasons, that embodies a lot of the honor and values that we expect to see of leaders in society, and that profession is completely closed to women. So I'm going to begin by telling you that the battlefield of the past doesn't look like we necessarily think it did. And this is actually especially true in the context of Britain, the UK, and its wider imperial ambitions prior to the 19th century. So there were, in fact, lots of different types of women on the battlefield. We had women who were providing essential service support on the battlefield, not just sexual services, but critical logistical services. We had women who were dressed as men who were on the battlefield. And sometimes these disguises were so convincing that no one ever found out until after their service that they were serving alongside a woman. So in these pictures, we have the person who is on the left of my screen is a vivandière or a cantinière. That's a French logistical provider who brought food, water, drink, essential services right onto the battlefield. They served with the French army, and you can see she has kind of a quasi-military uniform until the start of the 20th century. And that's the pictures actually both on the left and the right. And the one in the middle is Albert Cashin, who's actually Jenny, who served in the American Civil War. And I won't focus on her today, but I'm happy to take questions about that afterwards. So the goal of my book is I want to weave these women that we're going to be talking about back into conventional military history. And I want to demonstrate that, in fact, they were making significant combat contributions. They were there as a normal part of military history. They were there as a normal part of battlefield action. And that if one of the other things that's puzzling is that this history existed at the time in which militaries were beginning to be forced to make the decision as to whether or not they were going to allow women in combat. So there were plenty of examples, if people had bothered to look, of women displaying all of the qualities that men in charge suspected that they didn't have. So physical courage, fortitude, the ability to withstand battlefield conditions, the physical strength to withstand battlefield conditions, the ability not to be a distraction, all of these kinds of things. And I think critically, it shows that a lot of these women are not just victims of war. Often women's role in military history is a story of victimhood. It's all of the horrible ways in which women are impacted by war. And I don't want to deny that that's true, that is an absolutely essential part of military history, but so is this one, the story where women have agency and they make choices about what they are going to do and how they are going to live alongside or maybe even thrive inside the machine of war. So the three main themes of the book, and I'm going to illustrate these with British examples for you, is that women were actually successful and capable military leaders. So women have agency, they're not just victims, as we've talked about, and that question of bravery and physical capability on the battlefield as support, but also in combat itself. So I'll begin by talking about women generals. And again, it's not very common that you would have a woman general. This shouldn't surprise us, after all, that generals are a very small subset of the overall pattern of military service. But we do in fact see women's leadership. And the example I'll focus on today is, of course, Boudicca, our most famous British example, and Joan of Arc. I'd love to tell you a bit about Jinga, and I will, but I'll focus more on her in questions if anybody has them. These three women are all examples of people who displayed incredible qualities of leadership, incredible feats of strategy. And in the case of Jinga, who is an Angolan queen in the 17th century, an extraordinary capacity to lead in the most brutal conditions of warfare imaginable over a 40-year period, all the while trading off and contending between different parties, other African parties, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the corresponding with the Vatican. She was quite extraordinary. But we'll focus on the two in which the British will have the most experience, and that is, of course, Joan of Arc and Boudicca. And what I find so interesting about both of these examples is that both of these women clearly demonstrate all the capacities that you need of a general, but are dismissed. We dismiss Joan of Arc as an example of generalship because, of course, if you were English at the time, she was a witch, and if you were French at the time, she was granted her powers by God. So she wasn't actually capable herself. She was basically magic. And Boudicca gets dismissed by the Romans as a barbarian, as an example of a society that is so other that they would actually have a woman lead them into battle. Even though Boudicca's impact was so significant, one of my favorite facts I found in the book is that in the cities that she attacked, there is still something that archaeologists call the Boudiccan destruction layer, which is a layer of ash, which is so significant you can actually see it in the sedimentary archaeological layers. So what we do when we erase these capacities of women is that we say, look, they're not capable of being leaders, and the examples that we have that pop up, they're exceptions that we can dismiss in one way or the other. But in fact, there is a through line of women's military leadership, which again is very prominent in the British context, and that is in sieges. So sieges are the predominant form of military action in Europe for a considerable period of time. And of course, female participation in sieges is not unusual. And both as a regular combatant and as indeed a director of these sieges. So we have lots of examples of women rushing to the defense of their towns, building walls, throwing things over the walls, stabbing people as they come up. The statue up there is a French woman who is famous for chopping people's arms off as they tried to scale the walls. But we also see women's military leadership being quite significant. So to be a woman of means in this period meant that you needed to learn how to run your household. And running your household was not just a matter of making sure that there was food staples and the house was clean and that the servants were happy. It was a matter of provisioning your house in the likelihood of an attack. And so you would also need to make sure that you had all of the things you needed to defend your house. So we have two very famous sieges in the English Civil War that were both led by women, among a number, but these are the most famous, and they're from both sides of the English Civil War. The picture in the top right corner is Charlotte de la Tremouille, who is the Countess of Derbyshire, and she led the longest female-led siege of the Civil War, during which she directed the entire siege operation, when to sally forth, when to stay in, when to fire. And we know this because we have the accounts of her household, including soldiers who were stationed there that talk about her military leadership. On the other side of the English Civil War, we have Lady Brilliant Harley, who did exactly the same thing, but died ill very tragically during the middle of the siege. Both of these women demonstrate, and they are among a cast of many, many, many others, that women were in fact engaged in military leadership. But again, this was very easy to dismiss because people would say, well, a siege is not a proper battlefield, and the defense of a grand house, that's not proper fighting. And my response to that has been, well, this is the most common type of warfare that we see in Europe for a considerable period of time. And it's rather convenient to dismiss that as not being proper warfare when in fact women are reasonably prominent in it and quite prominent in it. We have other examples of this worldwide as well, but not just in the European context. So I want to turn now to the idea that the history of women's military service shows that women are in fact very brave and very physically capable. I find this particularly interesting because, as I mentioned before, in the context of late 20th and early 21st century decisions about whether or not women were capable of combat, nobody goes back and looks at this historical record, which, had they done so, I think is replete with examples of where women served with distinction and where they were able to be on the battlefield without causing significant drama of any kind, and in fact, where they demonstrated huge physical capacity. So I won't tell you about the person carrying the head in much detail. This is a Dahomey warrior. Again, I'm happy to return to this in questions. From the late 18th century to the end of the 19th century, the kingdom of Dahomey, which is now Benin in West Africa, used as their crack troops a regiment of women soldiers who were widely regarded by observers to be far superior to the male soldiers around them. And very effective fighters. The French Foreign Legion fought against them a lot towards the end of the 19th century and really didn't like it. So there's some great historical accounts of that. But I want to focus for today on the two phenomena which we see most commonly associated with the British Army. And that is the phenomenon of the cross-dressed woman and the phenomenon of the camp follower and later the regimental wife. So we'll begin by talking about those camp followers because, again, very effective tactic to dismiss them as people who were merely there to provide sexual services. And I don't think there's any point in glossing it over. Of course, many of them were there to provide sexual services. Many of them were following in a monogamous kind of way, boyfriends or husbands to war. And many of them were there not to provide those services, but to provide other essential battlefield services. Something that I think people are not always aware of is that these services were not rearguard services. These services were on the front line. To provide them effectively, you had to be able to go out onto the battlefield to provision troops with water, which was absolutely essential, both so people didn't die of heat stroke, but also so people could safely operate their artillery and their guns. These women may not have been fighting. In fact, probably they weren't most of the time, but they certainly picked up weapons. And we have lots of accounts of this to defend themselves, to defend their husbands, to replace their husbands if their husbands were wounded while firing their gun or firing their artillery piece. So we have lots of examples of this. But I think the critical thing that these camp follower women show us is an extraordinary level of physical fortitude. So if you look at the picture of the man and the woman together, that's a German picture, but it shows that she's carrying all the gear. He's walking along next to her, and she's carrying a huge amount of things on her back. And this was incredibly common. These women would carry all of the things that they needed to survive. They would often do pillaging while their husbands were away fighting, so they could support the military family. They were incredibly strong, and they had to survive the rigors of the battlefield in exactly the same way as the men around them had to survive the rigors of the battlefield. We'll turn now and talk a little bit more about the cross-dressed woman phenomenon. So in every European army, and in fact in most armies worldwide in the pre-19th century period, there are accounts of women who dress up as men in order to join the military. The data about this is pretty fascinating. So in the US Civil War context, we have more precise numbers. So we know that there were several hundred women who served on both sides of the American Civil War. The record keeping about this is interesting because many of these women were only uncovered when they were wounded, and some of them were only uncovered after their military service had been completed, and then they decided that they would quite like a pension along the lines of that their male colleagues received. So we don't know, there may be lots of these women that we never have ever uncovered because we don't know that they were, their disguises were successful essentially. And we know this because we do have accounts of seeing lots of women's bodies among the dead at various battlefields and women's bodies in soldiers' graves at battlefields as well. So we do know that this happened. Again, can't really quantify the scale of it. And in fact, I'm not sure that the scale of it is necessarily as important as people might think. I think, again, what I find interesting about this is historical evidence of women who were perfectly capable of combat and, in fact, very good at combat. Often what happens when these women get uncovered is that they aren't sent home. They actually carry on serving. And Many of them became quite famous. So Anne Mills, who's in this central picture, and in the central picture here, Hannah Snell, they both sort of became quite famous celebrities in their day. And Hannah Snell had a one-woman show that she presented about her exploits. The German picture there is Katharina Link. She's very interesting because her case demonstrates all of the ways in which women would physically disguise themselves, including the use of a fake penis, to make sure that they could go carousing with other soldiers and hopefully go undetected. So I think that the story that I like to tell people, and that I have uncovered in the book, is that the battlefield prior to the 19th century, and certainly from about the 16th century until the 19th century, if not a little bit earlier than that, was actually a fairly co-ed place. It was not a battlefield that was a band of brothers. It was a battlefield that contained a large number of women. And in the British context, later on, it contained a large number of wives, which is incredibly interesting in and of itself. The situation of wives definitely caused regimental commanders some problems, and I'll talk about that in a minute. There were always regulations being issued about how many wives were allowed to come and what they were and were not allowed to do. But the service of those wives was absolutely essential, and we have accounts of British Army operations from the American Revolutionary Wars right through to the Crimea of, again, women who were following the regiment, who picked up arms to take the place of their husband, who displayed extraordinary levels of physical courage and of capacity to withstand discomfort. And again, these stories don't demonstrate that women were capable of fighting per se, but they do demonstrate a lot of those physical attributes that women were deemed not to have over 100 years later. So if this is the story, if the battlefield didn't look like we expected it to look, had lots of women on it, the question we have to ask ourselves is what changed? Because clearly something did change. And I think for me, this has been one of the most interesting parts of doing my research. And the first thing that changes is clearly warfare itself. So these armies, which contained large numbers of camp followers and later on wives, these were unwieldy structures that were not particularly logistically well organized. And if you had the choice of a highly professionalized army with a formal logistics arm that provided what you needed when you needed, rather than having a whole host of people, women and children, following along the army pillaging, obviously this is the superior strategic choice. And so part of what happens is that people begin to recognize that there's a better way of doing warfare. Logistics gets professionalized, women get removed from those roles as a result, although, as I mentioned before, in France, it takes a little bit longer. But quite correctly, this previous way of warfare is deemed to be inferior to the current way of warfare. So that really helps solidify the view that women shouldn't be on the battlefield, because it is clearly better to run a more regimented, more organized way of warfare. And that way of warfare becomes particularly masculine. So the reason why I have this picture of the gentleman with the mustache is that mustaches become a military uniform requirement in many European militaries of a particular size and shape. And I gather in the Prussian military, you had to have a black mustache, and that was just the rule. So I use this as an example of pointing out, as we move through a period where conscription becomes common, obviously it becomes much harder for women to evade physical checks and join cross-dressed as men. So warfare changes, and this is definitely a crucial part of the story. But the other thing that changes is ideas about femininity and class. So throughout the 19th century in Europe, in Britain, but everywhere, there is the development of a notable middle class, and that middle class is aspirational. And the class to which they are aspiring in particular is a very, 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 very delicate version of femininity, where women were lauded for being physically incapable and for being delicate and for being beautiful and for being adornments, rather than having qualities of physical strength and being a bit coarse, and as the women who would have been camp followers were. So what we see is when that sort of takes root, a woman who's dressed like the women in these pictures, it would in fact be immoral and outrageous to place her on the battlefield, because she wouldn't survive. And as this becomes the model for femininity and what people aspire to, as the middle class grows, that becomes more and more entrenched. One of the things I find massively interesting is that the Russians maintain a long tradition of women in combat, much longer, with women cross-dressing and the whole works. And part of the reason for this is, of course, Russia at the turn of the 20th century is still 94% peasant. It does not have a middle class. So this aspirational ideal of womanhood is very different in that context. And you still have plenty of women around who people see performing very hefty physical tasks when you have a society which is 94% peasant. So by the time we hit the period of World War I, European militaries, and the British are definitely not alone in this, experience a bit of a challenge because World War I is going to require total mobilization. But there has been a period of at least 25 years, if not more, depending on where in Europe we are, where militaries have been extremely masculine and have been excluding women's participation. And so the idea is, how do you totally mobilize your society without mobilizing women? And if you need to mobilize women, how are you going to do it in such a way that protects them from the ravages of combat? And the answer here is extremely interesting. What happens is that this is the period of time where the term home front actually enters our lexicon. It doesn't exist previously. Its French equivalent appears during this period as well. So this is the period where we suddenly get a very sharp distinction between front lines and home front. And this is because if you have those lines drawn, you can keep women safe behind them. You can say, well, we're going to mobilize people into all kinds of different roles. But what we're going to do is do it in such a way that keeps women out of combat. And this is, of course, presented at the time as being absolutely for women's own safety. So these lines are drawn. They're very sharp and they're very clear. They're drawn in every context. And then once this concept of the front line enters the lexicon, so too does a very sharp distinction in warfare between combatant and non-combatant positions. And that distinction is really important, and it continues to run right through until the end of the combat exclusion, which in the UK, of course, doesn't happen until the 2000s. So we have this sharp idea of the front line and the home front. But when I started researching World War I, as a result of this distinction, I was worried it wasn't going to be that interesting. And what I found was it's actually exceptionally interesting, because in the British context in particular, but again throughout Europe, what makes it possible for militaries to have women's auxiliaries that are non-combatant is women have organized them themselves. So this is obviously a huge period of great female organization. So we have the suffragette movement, but we have all kinds of women involving themselves in various types of political movement, peace movements, et cetera, et cetera. And organizing for warfare is no different. So we have various women's military auxiliaries that are set up prior to the outbreak of war and shortly after the outbreak of war, where women are preparing themselves to serve their country like the men alongside them. Now, this is a very difficult conundrum for authorities throughout the world. We have these in the US, we have it in France, we have it in Germany, because, of course, military service has been the route to getting the vote for many European countries. And societally, nobody wants women to have the vote. So you can understand why people were concerned about giving women military service. And in the US, they actually call this bullets for ballots, that there is an understanding that you might actually get the vote by doing it this way. It's not the case that all of these women's organizations had a suffrage component to them, but it is the case that many of them did. They were all very variable in terms of how militarized they were. So we have Edith Vane Tempest Stewart, Lady Londonderry, she's in the portrait there. She sets up a more palatable women's organization, and she does it because she's got this problem of contending with these women who wear military uniforms and drill and actually seem to want to fight themselves. And in fact, we do have not just organizers in World War I, but we do have rule breakers. There are lots on the Russian side that I can talk about in questions, but the two I'd like to talk about today are, we have lots of letters of British women to the press in this period talking about how they are actually perfectly capable of joining up entirely, thank you very much, and would quite like to do so. And then one of my favorite women from the book is Flora Sands. Flora was British daughter of an Irish clergyman who tried to join one of the nursing detachments on the Western Front and was denied. So she went to Serbia, where she ended up driving an ambulance, and through a series of twists of fate, ended up as a corporal in the Serbian army, and she fought with the Serbs throughout the war. Her memoirs are extraordinary. They're very funny. And she was hugely brave, and in fact served again in the Serbian army during World War II, but was very quickly interned, and eventually ends up coming back to the UK. But she fought alongside the men, and her experiences of her account of her experiences, she's sitting in trenches, she's being shot at, she's very seriously wounded and comes back to the battlefield. So again, an example of a woman. And she was serving as a woman, so the men around her knew she was a woman. She wasn't a distraction. She was very successful. So the World War I think, is a very critical turning point in understanding the history of women in combat. And this is because it has such an immense cultural place in most combatant states of World War I, as being this very dominant cultural force and touchstone for how we understand war. And the horrors of the battlefield, combined with the phenomenon of the exultation and the bonds that come from fighting in a group of men, these sort of combine to solidify the view that women shouldn't have been on the battlefield at all. So either the war was so terrible, you would be disgusting and immoral if you allowed your sister, your daughter, your wife to experience it, or it was a very special place wherein men could bond in a way that they couldn't without women around them. Those ideas become very dominant, and it becomes very hard then for women to break on to the battlefield. So what we have in the 20th century is the birth of the combat exclusion. So we now have a very clear and very explicit set of rules that women can support the war but not actually fight. And this means that for the rest of the 20th century, right through to the 21st century, militaries have to consider how they're going to deploy women without allowing them to fight. And that creates all kinds of puzzles and conundrums for militaries going forward. So as the coming of the next war happens, again, we have a situation where the organization of women's auxiliaries happens because women organize themselves. So I probably didn't mention clearly enough in the World War I example that these auxiliaries in Britain, but also France and Germany, the authorities just take them over and repurpose them as formal military auxiliaries. But they were in fact initially set up by women themselves. In the interwar period, we have a lot of the same thing happening again. So we have women who are setting up their own military organizations that may or may not be a little bit dodgy. So sometimes they're not appropriate. They get in trouble with the authorities, but sometimes they are very much set up by women of the establishment, like Lady Londonderry, and they drill in Hyde Park. They send women with packing lists. So these are women themselves who see the coming of war. They know that women are going to be needed, and they're making sure that the women are going to be ready. Both in World War I and World War II, one of my other fun facts is that women were recruited on a principle of dilution. So these auxiliaries were necessary, and they were necessary in quite large numbers because you needed more women to do the job of one man. Even for a clerking kind of role, that you would have to have 5 women to replace 4 men. So that wasn't as simple as a one-to-one swap. So British women are getting themselves organized. And by the late 1930s, they sort of precede officialdom in getting themselves organized. But again, they're subsumed into the wider structure of the British military. And Britain, as every combatant country does, struggles with what to do, with how to mobilize women while simultaneously keeping them out of combat. And one of the things I argue in the book is that there are 3 situations in World War II where women either come close to combat, or arguably should have been in combat, or in fact were in combat. And these are all ways in which the British military sort of skirts the role of combat as it tries to make sure that women are participating, and it needs them, but it needs to set parameters. So the first and probably the most well-known example is the example of the anti-aircraft batteries, which were operated by women. These were set up as a result of an experiment to see whether or not it would work by a far-reaching general called Sir Frederick Pyle. He believed that women were perfectly capable of running these batteries. However, it was deemed to be totally publicly unpalatable if the women were actually firing the gun in the battery. So there were men in the batteries whose job it was to do that. Women did every other aspect of operating the battery, from positioning the guns to firing the guns, everything except firing, rather. One of the incongruities, which I find a bit horrifying, is that all the members of the battery would perform sentry duty. The men would do it with a rifle, and the women would do it with a pickaxe handle because they weren't allowed to be armed. Women were involved in the repositioning of aircraft through the Air Transport Auxiliary. They were able to fly every single plane in the RAF, bar the heaviest flying boats. They were paid eventually on an equal level with the men, but they were not ever allowed to engage the enemy. And we have a lot of evidence from their memoirs that they really wanted to, but they were not even allowed to fire if they were fired upon while they were repositioning the aircraft. And the last example is, of course, the extraordinary women of Special Operations Executive, who were not only trained in combat, but led large groups of men in combat, were trained in every aspect of combat, from weaponry to unarmed combat. This is Pearl Witherington, who is, again, one of my favorites. There was nothing particularly notable about Pearl Witherington other than that she spoke fluent French. Through her training, her officers thought that she was the best shot, either male or female, they'd seen come through the course. She ends up leading a force of about 6,000 to 7,000 French resistance fighters in Europe on the ground. The Germans have a price on her head because they consider her to be so dangerous. So again, these are all examples, if people had bothered to look, of women's military capacity and ability to fight. So I won't talk about the World War II experience elsewhere in Europe today, but I'm happy to ask questions about it. One of the things I find interesting is that all the combatant states of World War II find a different way around the question of the combat exclusion and what they're going to do about it. From the Soviets, who have 500,000 women, 500,000 to 800,000 women under arms, to the Germans, who largely managed to avoid it entirely. I think there are some very interesting tensions there, and also some fantastic stories, so I'm happy to take questions on it. After World War II, we famously have a very sharp swerve back towards normal in all of these combatant states, where they want to return to a pre-war world after the disruption and the horrors of war. And this coincides with a very, very firm swerve away from women in combat. So throughout the combatant states, we see a very sharp exclusion of women from combat forces. So in most militaries around the world, women stay in the military, but in very small numbers, about 2% of total forces, and pretty much exclusively in auxiliaries. They are pretty much exclusively unarmed, and that is often a very deliberate choice, as it is in the case of the Women's Royal Army Corps. In Australia, I do like the fact that you were allowed to stay in the military forces once married if you had your husband's consent and also special talents, but this sort of stricture is not abnormal. This doesn't begin to change until the late 1970s, where partly the pressure of the feminist movement and partly the pressure of demographics, there aren't enough people who want to fight available in most Western liberal democracies. Therefore, militaries have to begin opening their doors to women in larger numbers again. And then the parameters around these auxiliaries begin to change, but the combat exclusion stays very, very firmly in place. This is assisted by 1950s social attitudes, and it's also assisted by the Cold War. So the absence of expeditionary warfare in general means the combat exclusion isn't tested in the way that it had been tested in World War II. So it's pretty easy during the Cold War to have a very sharp distinction between your front line and your home front. It's pretty easy, as it was the case in the British Army, to not allow women in forward deployed positions, and that is a pretty effective way of keeping them out of combat. So as war changes, we begin to see all of this change. I'm not going to talk about this now, but I do want to just flag it that in truth, only some wars change. So women remain a normal part of warfare in rebel and insurgent movements around the world to a very significant degree. So this gives you a sense of the geographical spread of that, but I won't be talking about that today. So the combat exclusion in the West is very strong. but it is not impervious to feminism. And so it's not impervious to the fact that in the rest of society, women are becoming increasingly equal. And as I said before, demographically, there are pressures about admitting larger numbers of women to the military, which require the creation of fences around combat roles. One of the conundrums, which is very interesting, is that lawsuits have not actually been an effective way for women to get into combat. And in fact, in both the US and the UK, arguably made it harder for some time for women to enter combat. So in the UK case, there's quite a well-known lawsuit involving a cook who tried to transfer to the Royal Marines and was rejected on the grounds that the Marines are an exclusively combat force and women aren't allowed in combat. Therefore, she wasn't allowed to serve. This case went to the European Court of Justice, which decided that as a matter of national security, that Britain was allowed to make its own decisions in relation to combat. And so that case actually helps preserve the combat exclusion in the UK for quite a long time, and explains why the UK is quite late to open women in combat. The feminist movement is not generally wildly enthused about pushing for this specifically. So the feminist movement is important in that it's increasing general social equality, but a little bit less significant because in this particular case, feminists are not generally, there's very strong links between feminism and pacifism, particularly through the 70s, and they're not particularly keen on pushing towards allowing women into combat. So what we see as the main mechanism for keeping women out of combat is the definition of combat. So once you have this idea that you have to have women in your forces, but they're not allowed to fight, you have to be absolutely explicit about what constitutes fighting and what doesn't. And different militaries have different solutions. So the US operates on very complicated combat definitions. And in the UK, as I mentioned, the decision not to allow women in forward deployed posts means that it's a pretty effective way of keeping women out of combat. But you do have conundrums in both militaries, things like, what if you need a carpenter who's at the front line, but they're just a carpenter? Well, the answer is that position is a combatant position, whereas a woman who's driving a truck, who might get fired upon and theoretically have to fire back if she's forward deployed, that's not a combatant position. So you get these weird tensions. And you also get awkward situations. So this comes from an oral history. This is an Australian woman officer who talks about how that even as early as the Falklands, women were wanting to go alongside the men that they had been with and were not allowed to go on the grounds of these rules about forward deployment. So again, what happens, what causes the change? Again, the answer is that war changes. And once we are back in the business of fighting major expeditionary war, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, or the counterinsurgent war and the 360-degree battlefield, it's impossible to sustain the fiction that women who are driving trucks well armed are not engaged in combat, because of course they do engage in combat. They have to. And they are decorated for their service. They're wounded. They engage in conspicuous acts of gallantry. It becomes very, very hard to sustain the fiction that women aren't actually fighting. And that's particularly true in the UK and the US militaries, who are, of course, deploying to these conflicts in large numbers. What I find incredibly interesting is the US military and the Australian military make the decision to open their militaries to women in all combat positions reasonably early, so between 2011, 2012, 2013. And Britain is very resistant for a long time. And as I said before, this is partly that legally they've been enabled by that decision that I mentioned earlier. There is an extraordinary history of a large number of studies conducted in the British military. One of the features of that decision was that the Surtur decision, the legal decision, is that the British military had to every 5 years or so respond and assess whether or not they could still keep women excluded from combat. And they did that through these studies. The studies pretty much conclusively find that women are pretty good at combat, and they're almost always dismissed. Most significantly, there was one in 2000, which The Guardian uncovered as part of a major expose, that women did very well in that particular study. But again, it was dismissed as, well, this is not a real battlefield. Somebody says, oh, off the record, it's just fireworks with camping. You know, it's not a serious military exercise. We have no evidence that women would be good at fighting in a real war. And this is a very common argument that, you know, you can do all the studies you like, but we don't want to test this in actual combat because it would be a grave threat to our national security. Iraq and Afghanistan cause a challenge because, of course, the combat exclusion is tested in a real war. And yet it still takes Britain quite a long time to decide to lift the combat exclusion, which they do in July 2016, and it's complete by 2018. Interestingly, the internal documents and the discussions that I've seen at the time suggest that they're still running this argument that there's no evidence that women might be successful in a real combat role, even after the Australian and the American militaries have both allowed women into combat roles. So it's a very high level of resistance. I'll finish very, very briefly by just alluding to one of the things that I think is very interesting in the world as we see now, which has become, unfortunately and dramatically more violent since I finished writing the book and since the book was published, is that we know that there's a very profound link in democratic states that backslide, that become authoritarian. The first thing they do is take away women's rights. It's a very common pattern. And interestingly, we see this very sharply in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, where Ukraine has a very large number of women in frontline positions. They have about 20% of their total forces are female. It's among the highest in the world. And that was the case prior to the war. And numbers have actually obviously gone up since then. The Russians, despite a very proud tradition of female combat, have no women in combat positions in the military and are in fact choosing to conscript men out of jails and rely on dodgy private security companies rather than deploy women. And you can see this is very much a conflict about democracy in a lot of ways. And one side uses women and the other side doesn't. And the absence of Russian women from that conflict can only really be explained by authoritarian ideological politics, because obviously a couple of women fighters would probably be better than reluctant conscripts coming from jail. But that does take me to the end of what I wanted you to talk about today. I promised Dudley I would leave some time for questions, and I'm really happy to answer them either on the material that I presented or the material that I danced around a little bit, because I wanted to focus on the British experience. But thank you so much. I've really, really enjoyed this opportunity to speak to you today, and I'm really looking forward to answering your questions.
Sarah, thank you so much. I hadn't done this prior to it, but can I declare an interest? And my interest is I lived through this change. I was a military policeman. I spent the whole of my service in an organization where I believed men and women were treated the same, with the exception that whilst we still had the WRAC, our women were not allowed the ability to command our units. But as soon as the WRAC disappeared, those soldiers and officers that were military police in all but name now had the opportunity to command. And I would always maintain that some of my best soldiers and some of my best officers were women, always were. Our last Provost Marshal Army was a woman, and our current Provost Marshal Army is a woman. And finally, I married a female officer who was also serving with the military police at the time and had done special duties. But yet, in BOR, as soon as the flag went up, they were all moved to the rear area. Iniquitous. And we're still doing this. Well, they're not proper soldiers in the British Army, I'm afraid. The Deputy Chief of the General Staff, Ashley, you'll be horrified. She's not a proper general because she's Royal Signals. I can just see Ashley now seething when I've said that. Anyway, I move on. Thank you. That was a fascinating talk, and really, really relevant to our times. There are some questions coming in, and I will put them up on the screen. And the first one is from Magnus, who's asked, did the evaporation of the rear in the First World War have any effect?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. No. I think that the experience the experience of the horrors of war, and the one thing I didn't talk about is also the impact of war on civilian women in Europe. Probably just, well, it does have an effect actually, it just solidifies things. So what happens again, and I think particularly in Britain, is an unusual case because it escapes the direct horrors of impact on civilian women in the sense of attacks by male soldiers, which you obviously can't escape if you're in France or if you're in Belgium. And I think that part of the imaginary that happens is people see what happens to these civilian women and think, this is horrific, this can't be allowed to happen. And that kind of solidifies the view that women should not be anywhere near combat and we are better off keeping them safe. And, you know, there's not a lot wrong with that view. We should probably keep most civilians safe from combat because it does horrific things to be living on a battlefield. But yeah, I think it probably does sort of join in and pull together this view that we really must keep women safe.
Thank you. Paula has asked, the UK used the perceived problem of impacts on unit cohesion for a long time to resist opening roles to women. Do you think this reflects a greater focus on culture rather than practical issues? And if so, who do you think the UK was susceptible? Why do you think the UK was susceptible to those arguments of culture?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked this question because I find this absolutely fascinating, and I have a whole section in the book talking about this. So there are two main arguments that are used in the late 20th century to keep women out of combat. One is the argument of physical strength, and the other is the argument of unit cohesion. So physical strength, interestingly, gets chucked out really, really early because actually, if you set standards, people can meet the standards. And those militaries who are wanting to keep women out clock into this pretty quickly. And actually, we have evidence that they deliberately switched to unit cohesion because unit cohesion is much harder to answer. So what happens when you set physical standards is not every woman can meet them, but a lot of women can. And then you're going to have women in your military. But if you say, look, there's this magical bond that happens between men, and if we put women in there, the magical bond will be destroyed. And it's far too dangerous for us to test this in real life because we would be conducting an experiment on the battlefield in real time, and it would have devastating consequences for our national security. That is really hard to counter because it's a magical bond. I mean, how do you provide evidence that the magical bond is or is not going to be challenged? And people certainly try, like there's a lot of studies that are done on unit cohesion. Unfortunately, they all pretty much show that once women are present, there is an initial settling in period and then unit cohesion is absolutely fine. Historically, this is absolutely the case. People often talk about how they forget that they're serving alongside people of a different gender. And when people see competence, as actually, Dudley, as you mentioned in your remarks, when people see competence and they see there's no problem, they kind of get over it. So the question is, why is unit cohesion so significant in the UK? And I think for a couple of reasons. One is that the UK is remarkably resistant to the inclusion of women compared to other like countries. So Canada admits women in combat roles in 1989. Australia and the US, as I say, do so 2011, they begin the process, so quite a lot earlier than the UK. And there are noises about it happening in both of those countries quite a lot earlier. I think that it probably has to do with a very significant role of military tradition. I think that my hunch is, although I haven't done the research to confirm it, my hunch is that the relationship between government and military in the UK has been more one where the government listens to the military a bit more. So in the Australian case, the reason why that's my hypothesis is in the Australian case, the change was undoubtedly because a Labor Minister of Defence got absolutely sick of sex scandals in the Australian Defence Force and just opened combat roles to women. There was a major sex scandal at the Australian Defence Force Academy, and he said, that's it, we're done. The solution to this problem is we're opening combat roles to women. And I don't see that dynamic at work. And you can see hints of this in all of those reports that come back, is generally the ministers agree with the military assessment that the report is incorrect. And in Australia and the US, what happens is that the government stops agreeing with the military that those reports are correct. So it's partly a deliberate strategy to keep women out. There's no doubt about that. And it's partly, I think, related to just the nature of military tradition and civil military relations in the UK.
I can't agree more. I find it fascinating about as you say, the setting of standards and rules as a mechanism for keeping women out, but actually it doesn't work. I did a role in setting soldier recruiting policy in the early 1990s, and women were being excluded on the grounds of height. They weren't tall enough. Absolutely, it was ridiculous because we had men who were shorter than the height of the women that were being excluded.
Yeah, I was having a chat with an Australian general a few weeks ago, and he was saying to me that when he when they made the change, he would go around and talk to infantry units, and they would say to him, "Oh, we've got a terrible problem, sir. These women aren't going to be able to change the tires in the largest military trucks." And this guy's not a tall man, and he said, "Mate, I can't change them." But I'm too small, and that would generally shut them up.
Yeah. John has asked this question: Do you do any comparison with women serving in navies?
Yeah.
The Royal Navy was slow in women serving at sea until the 1990s, but now those first women have commanded ships on operational deployments.
Yeah. So here's an interesting thing, perhaps controversial when you have a talk to the Army Society, is that Air Forces and Navies universally integrate first. So, and this probably has to do with distance from actual hand-to-hand combat. So it's the confrontation between a physical fight between a male and a female that freaks a lot of people out. And the farther you get away from that, the easier it is to integrate women. So Air Forces tend to be first, Navies tend to be second. Once people can get over the boys and girls will be on a ship together, horror of horrors, what might happen, that tends to settle itself down. And then navies have, by and large, in the militaries I've studied, been very successful at integration. And again, we see this, after all, we see this at the very highest levels of the US military now. So, we see women have moved through the ranks very quickly, comparatively, in navies. We also have a great tradition of cross-dressing sailors and cross-dressing Marines, of women who manage to maintain their disguise as well on a ship, which I think is pretty impressive historically. So yes, the navies and Air Forces tend to be farther ahead. Interestingly now, although women seem to have entered the Air Force earlier, they're allowed into fighter roles a little bit later. And you don't see the same impact. So you see most senior women, as far as my research shows, most senior women in most Western militaries come through navies and not through Air Forces. So that would be an interesting little puzzle to tease out further, I think.
How do you answer the question that, well, the wives will never stand for it? That was another old whore that used to, sorry, I'm using it in a different text that way, that was put forward against the employment and destroying unit cohesion. The wives wouldn't.
Yeah, wouldn't cope. Yeah, and I mean, look, that's not one you hear very often anymore. So when I have people who are sharply critical of my views, and they do write me lovely letters sometimes, that's not one that they bring up. They bring up, oh, I served with a woman once and she vomited when things got really scary. To which my response is, has that ever happened with any men that you've served with? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. So it's not one that you see. I think it's one of those ones where, in reality, we all work in co-ed workplaces anyway. And many of us work in co-ed workplaces where we go away with people of the opposite sex, or indeed of the same sex. And, this is just something that adults navigate in a normal fashion in most facets of society, and it doesn't seem to cause problems there. I think the unit cohesion argument, again, what I find fascinating and why I so enjoyed writing the book, is if you look at the historical record on these things, I mean, sure, there are always going to be issues around sex. There were issues around sex in single-sex regiments, right? There are always going to be issues around people's sexual behavior because it's part of being a human. But it doesn't seem to have a negative effect on unit cohesion. And again, one of the things that has just been shown time and time again is more diverse units perform better because they think better. Diversity gives you a range of opinions, and that's something that's just sort of repeatedly shown.
Yeah. It was always my experience. It was the units that had never worked with women, and officers and senior NCOs who had never worked with women were the ones that always had the greatest difficulty. Those that had been habituated it, like myself and maybe Ashley in the signals, etc., it was never an issue because we saw it on a daily basis. My biggest bugbear in the army was always, if I addressed a soldier, it was Corporal Jones or Sergeant Smith, and I would have infantry and cavalry officers that would talk to Jenny or June or whatever, and couldn't see that this is not the way to do business. Anyway, it shouldn't turn into my personal bugbears for the evening. Sadly, we sort of dried up on the questions, Sarah, but that's not to say that I don't think that your presentation this evening has been anything other than fascinating. I was particularly taken by the comment about mustaches. Do you think that was a deliberate ploy, or just how it happened? I do know that the Adjutant General of the British Army, the day that he signed the order to remove moustaches, went down to the barber's shop and took it off because it had always annoyed him, but he was just had to obey regulations.
Sadly, I don't think it was a deliberate ploy. I like to mention as an example just because it's so bizarre, but also because it's a nice concrete example of the ways in which it would have become much harder to cross-dress and enter the forces. Although the women were very ingenious, that woman Katerina Link actually had 2 types of fake penis that she deployed on various occasions so that she would be more convincing. So I'm sure she would have, a fake mustache actually would have been no problem. I think the mustache regulations actually come from the fact that facial hair was really, most men had facial hair as a style in the 19th century, and militaries love rules. So you had to have a rule about what the facial hair consisted of. And therefore, that's where it comes from.
Do you think the absence of the female soldier in the Russian army of today is really to do with authoritarianism, or because as you said in your talk, that it was almost part of the tradition beforehand? Although of course there are a lot of myths, aren't there, about Soviet soldiers in the Second World War, female soldiers?
Well, look, I find this absolutely fascinating, because if by myths you mean an exaggerated type of myth, they're not myths in that sense at all, but they are heroic and became sort of emblematic in a lot of ways. But so the Soviet story of military service is fascinating. They have cross-dressed women in World War I. They have battalions that are set up towards the tail end of World War I, which are inundated with female volunteers from all over. But what happens is the World War I situation collapses and the Bolshevik Revolution happens and everybody gets pulled out. So you have individual women and regiments serving in World War I. And then in World War II, you also have, like I said, between 800,000 and 1 million women under arms in the Soviet army, everything from snipers to regular infantry, absolutely very significant. What happens at the end of the war is that these women are put back in their place in a degree to which, and I've just seen in the questions that due to the Soviet anti-women attitudes, yes, they're put back in their place to a degree which doesn't even happen in the West. That they're not allowed to speak about their military service. In fact, we only know about it because a very pioneering Soviet journalist called Svetlana Alexievich went around in the 1980s and took a oral history of these women soldiers, many of whom had never spoken about their military service prior to that time. So the women weren't allowed to march in the victory parades. Their service was totally suppressed. So yes, Russian culture in general, not just Soviet, has been very sexist. However, Putin is an extraordinary, obviously Putin is a very bad man, but his anti-women policies are sort of next level. He's changed the rules around domestic violence so it's now easier to commit certain acts of domestic violence in the Soviet Union than it was previously. He has done all the usual erosion of women's rights in relation to things like access to healthcare, access to abortion. These are all things that we see authoritarian states doing. So yes, it's a very deliberate choice, and it's quite bizarre when you consider that record of women's military service that you would choose instead to pull people out of jail or rely on the Wagner Group to fight your war for you rather than conscript women when you are fighting an army that contains quite a lot of women. It's a very strange disconnect.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to pull stumps. Before I do, and say thank you again to our speaker, I'm conscious that the treasurer is in the audience, and Rohan will not forgive me if I did not remind people that our talks are free to our members and they're free to non-members who attend, but we always welcome donations. And you'll find that when you leave this evening, you will be taken to a site which shows you where you can make a voluntary donation if you'd like to do so. Ashley has asked a question, so I will put it up on the screen.
Yeah, I can see it. Thanks, Ashley.
You have majored on male attitudes to female soldiers. What about female attitudes? To what extent do they think they have been fully integrated, and how much?
Oh dear. I'm just gonna have to.
Well, she'll come back in a second. She's just reconnecting. We'll just give her a bit of time. And if it doesn't work, well, we almost got to the end anyway. But I'd quite like to hear the answer to this, Ashley. So, yeah. She's using one of the 3 IA drills. So here we go. Our next talk is next month in March, and if I just refresh my memory as to what it is, we have yet to set a date, and that will be announced on the through the normal channels. It's Adam Prime who is talking on the Indian Army in the First World War, and I'm certain that there will be a great deal of interest in that. Yes, she's back. Here she is.
I'm back. I deployed my safety briefing and left and came back. I don't know why I froze. So actually, it's a really great question, and I'm actually doing a little bit of work on this now, and it's actually something that a lot of researchers have been working on, is talking to women about what their experiences are like. And I think very variable is the general answer. One of the concerns has been, and I think it's really important to be open about it, one of the concerns has been, even in militaries where women have had full integration for a long time, Canada is the example here, there are still lots and lots of problems. So the Canadian military, as you're probably aware, has been absolutely beset by scandals involving sexual harassment and by sort of attempts to deliberately block the advancement of women. So it's not a panacea just to allow the women in. You have to sort of make moves to try and support them once they're there. I think one of the things I went down a major rabbit hole about was firefighters. So this is probably the closest analogy we have to integrating an institution which has been very masculine. And what you find from that example is that it seems to take like 40 years minimum. It's a major cultural change. And therefore, the women who are going through as the vanguard level of that change probably need quite significant support, because they are shattering various ceilings. They call it the brass ceiling in the military, but it's very hard work to be the person whose job it is to do that shattering. And I think we probably require additional support in that sense to make sure that they are, to make sure that they don't leave, and to make sure that that process of integration continues successfully. From the historical record, what we find is that women really, the ones who, like all soldiers, some women really enjoy their service and they enjoy working with the men around them, and some women really don't. But gender doesn't seem to be the defining characteristic, when, especially from the World War II examples where you have long-term operational experience where people are working together for a period of years rather than just a short-term period.
Thank you. Yes, it's general. It takes at least a generation in the British Army for any change to be bedded in, if you like. Thank you so much, Sarah. That has been a fascinating talk, and the audience, I know, has appreciated it. I know that the people who will be watching this on the recording will enjoy it. We are particularly grateful for the fact that it's still only about 6 o'clock in the morning in Australia, and that you have joined us for our talk this evening. So thank you very much indeed. It only remains for me to remind people that next month Adam Prime is talking about aspects of the Indian Army, and you can sign up for that in the normal fashion. Sarah, thank you. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.